Go. All right. Okay. Well, everybody, Oksana's in. Good. That's great.
Hi, Oksana. Yeah.
I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this, what is going to be I'm sorry to say this, Milton, to set you up a wonderful and very exciting session. And really, Ian and I, especially, and Thomas, are really looking forward to it. So it's great. I just thought a very, very quick introduction before we move forward. Um, I don't know if you know this, but I think we met briefly at one of the TSOG conferences, probably as long ago as the 1980s, in Texas or
Quite quick.
something. It was quite quickly, and I was with Susan Stempleski, who you know, who's my co-author and who taught at Hunter College in New York. Anyway, what's most important is over the years, you've had this huge important and influence on the way people see interculture, intercultural training, and teaching in universities and colleges. And one of the key developments, which I think we shouldn't ignore, is the creation of the DMIS model, which you introduced, and which has been a crucial element, certainly in my training for companies and also for universities, in preparing people to accept and deal with culture shock, which is one of the major issues we all face. And you've had to face it, and so have I, and so has Ian and others when we've traveled overseas. So I think that's a really, really important development. And the DMS model, which is worth looking at in a book called Basic Concepts, published, I think, by International Culture. I've forgotten the name of the
Intercultural Press. Intercultural Press. Yeah.
Press. Is really a fundamental element of anything concerned with adaptation to intercultural understanding. And I think this particular lecture really expands that. I came across this, Milton, because I attended the session you ran for CIETA, the Society for International Education Training, and R is what?
Research.
And research.
Yes.
Took place in Frankfurt in 2020. And I was so impressed that I've incorporated what you said in my recognizance of yourself in everything I've done ever since. And it really has an impact of helping people understand what intercultural communication really should be about. It's not the stereotype of countries, essentialism. It's about individuals from diverse background with diverse personalities. And I think that's really got across and been really important. So having watched that, I wanted to get you to update it and to tell everybody about it and see how your thinking has moved on in the last 3 years, because I think this is a really, really important concept. So, Milton, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, very. And hello, everybody. If you feel like putting your camera on, but turn the audio off so that your barking dogs or meowing cats don't come through. But if you want to put the camera on, I'm happy to talk to people as opposed to talking to the camera. You know, you'll be able to see it. Now I'm looking at the camera. Now I'm looking at you, the people. I've got this big screen up here. So if you don't mind being seen, makes me feel better. Oh, okay. So I hope this is fun. In my experience with colleagues, we very seldom during breaks in our work talk about reification or epistemology. But that's the kind of thing that you can do in these, hours that you take, in front of your computer before dinner or after dinner. And that's what I hope we can do today, is a kind of a vacation from work, a bit of a cerebral vacation from work anyway. And it's going to be about language, because language is at the center of consciousness. And what intercultural communication, or all communication, is about consciousness. It's about the way in which we operate consciousness to coordinate with each other and do the kinds of things that human beings do. And it's all based on language. So I'm very happy to be speaking to the people who are central to that activity. I'm going to be showing you some slides, and going pretty fast through these slides and try to leave enough time. So we've got 10, 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you have something that you want to put into the chat, maybe Lillian can grab one of them, something that looks interesting if you want out of that, or otherwise we can just do it verbally at the end.
Sure.
So let's try doing the slides here and see if it works. Do you see a slide?
Perfect.
Yes. Good. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So here's the ravages of reification. I'm going to tell you what reification is for those of you who are not old Marxist scholars, where that was a common term, or for those of you who haven't been keeping up on general semantics, which was a popular idea back in the 60s. Or 50s and 60s, but most recently, it's a term that you see used a lot in the social constructivists, Berger and Luckman, and I've noticed that George Lakoff, who's a linguist that I respect a lot, also seems to be using that term rather freely. So I'm going to talk about that and constructivist intercultural concepts, meaning how can we use this idea of reification and de-reification to look at intercultural issues in a more appropriate way for what I think is the current paradigm that we're moving into. So let's see if I can change the slide. There we go. A couple resources. Rovelli is somebody I'll be talking about. He's a physicist who's doing wonderful work. I really highly recommend reading any of his books, all very accessible. He's a physicist. I'm actually updating that next one, work that I did 10 years ago, where I had this little thing with CITAR, the organization that Barry just was describing, where I said, we really shouldn't be comparing culture to an iceberg. And that got all kinds of response. People still come up to me today, 10 years later, and say, I think we should be using the iceberg, or good for you, we shouldn't be. But my point at the time was that the iceberg is it's a thing floating around in the water, and culture is not a thing. It's something we do. It's not something we have. And so I thought the metaphor was, again, here we come, a reification, that culture is a process. It's something that we are doing to coordinate ourselves with other human beings, but to treat it as if it's a thing, like an iceberg floating around in the water, misses the point in ways that I think are problematic. One of Lakoff's earlier books that I like a lot is Women, Fire, and Other Dangerous Things. First of all, just because what a great title that is, but otherwise, that was the book in which he resurrected the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis. And Sapir-Whorf and the whole idea of linguistic relativity was under attack from all sides for a long time. And wait a minute, I didn't want that to happen. For a long time, and he did a great job of resurrecting that. And then there's the Hayakawa reference, Language and Thought in Action, which is the classic piece from general semantics that deals with the idea of reification. There are lots of other ideas, but here's the text I want to use. This is from Berger and Luckman, The Social Construction of Reality. The institutional world is objectivated human behavior. That means behavior that's activity that's been put into objects. So is every single institution. In other words, despite the objectivity that marks the social world and human experience, does not thereby acquire an ontological status apart from the human activity that produced it. In other words, you can't treat something that you created as if has an existence that is not your creation. So reification implies that people are capable of forgetting their authorship of the human world, and further, that the dialectic between people, the producers of their products, is lost to consciousness. That is, people are capable, paradoxically, of producing a reality that denies them. Yeah, this is a wonderful a wonderful idea. And when you think about it, we do that all the time. I submitted that last sentence to the AI image generator, and that little image on the right-hand side there is what it came up with. So I always find it amusing to give these ideas to AI and see what kind of image, which are the sort of collective consciousness of human beings, that the AI has interesting ways of compiling. So that's AI's idea, I think, of the paradoxical denial of our existence by our own creation. I'm going to speak of some major turning points of consciousness. I think consciousness is an evolutionary development in human beings, and suggest that we're in a third turning point right now, and that part of the reason that this is an important topic is because we are likely in the midst of one of these big changes. The two I'm going to talk about are the cognitive revolution, and that's a term from Sapiens, and the consciousness revolution, which is a term from Julian Jaynes in Origin of Consciousness. And in the current turning point, I'm going to call it a meta-consciousness, in which we are de-reifying. We're trying to, to put the observer back into the process, basically, with language. And it involves a lot of meta-coordination, which is the coordinating of coordinated systems. And this is an idea that's been around. Margaret Mead, for instance, was, and Gregory Bateson were both very much into the sort of cybernetics of cybernetics and coordinating systems, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about what we all are doing, insofar as we're trying to do cross-cultural or intercultural work. Is we don't want to make everybody the same. We want to have people be different, but people need to be coordinated with each other. And if they don't have the traditional way of coordinating, which is similarity, cultural similarity, how do they coordinate? And the answer, I think, is something like this meta coordination. I'll say some more about it as we go along. And then let's apply that in the last few minutes to building intercultural viability. I use the term viability to mean the sort of evolution of intercultural work to meet this new paradigm. And I'll give you some ideas of how we can talk about concepts in a more constructivist or less reified way. Here's a Harari in Sapiens, who I say shares the common historical view that during this period of 70,000 to 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens acquired the ability to use metaphoric language. And you all know what metaphoric language is, to cooperate in larger groups, distinguishing themselves from the other species of humans like Neanderthals that were around. And the thesis, and this is not just his idea, but he does a really great job of expressing it, I think. The idea is that we human beings were not that much different than other organisms, able to coordinate ourselves in small groups and, and to get along and do our hunting and gathering and what we were doing. But that at this period, which he's calling the cognitive revolution, we were able to do an important thing, which is to stop using language only in its denotative way, which is to say, river, tree, ground, lion, and instead to use it metaphorically. That is to be able to say, let's encircle the prey. And the idea of using circle, not to point to a circle, but to refer metaphorically to the idea of generating a circle, that's metaphoric language. And this idea is that human beings were characterized, and maybe even continue to be characterized, by their ability to use language in this way. That this is what it is that differentiates us from other organisms that are able to use signaling and to use language in that sort of more denotative way, but as far as we know, to not use it in this metaphoric way. The roots, however, of reification are in this idea. So here is a quote from Harari. Ever since the cognitive revolution, sapiens have been living in a dual reality. On the one hand, the objective reality of rivers, trees, and lions, and on the other hand, the imagined reality of gods, nations, and corporations. And the idea was that the metaphors which we created, the gods and spirits and ideologies and god kings and all of the other ideas that we've had, were what it is that would allow larger groups of people to knit together, to coordinate these large groups, which in turn could be doing all of these activities that the smaller groups were not capable of doing, and gave us the competitive edge that has led us to be the dominant species of the Earth, to the detriment of the Earth, as we're now learning, but nevertheless, a fantastically successful evolutionary movement. There was another revolution that came after this one. This is Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. We won't go into the bicameral mind. It's an interesting idea, and you might want to go take a look at the book if you find what I'm saying to be interesting. But he says here, behaving and communicating, including languages, do not demand self-consciousness. You know, he uses consciousness, but he means self-consciousness. In other words, we can talk about things, even metaphorically, without saying, here I am talking about those things. Yeah. But he says, and indeed our ancestors thrived for most of their human history without it. But language through metaphor, again, is able to create new circumstances when necessary. And his idea was that that new circumstance was an increase of population. There's the population timeline up there, such that groups of small groups of human beings that were competing with one another and trying to kill each other. And, you know, read the Old Testament, you know, everybody's smiting each other all the time, right? You know, so we're all trying to kill each other, survive, you know, survive, kill or be killed. But at a certain point, there were so many people, because we were so successful in our coordination, that it became self-defeating to try to kill each other. And so we developed the idea that maybe we had a choice in that. Maybe we didn't have to kill people. Maybe other people were human like us and we could like negotiate with them or something. This is the basis of self-consciousness. And the exact metaphor that he uses is the idea of self as an object. So what self-consciousness is the putting of ourselves into the world as an object. And then to imply, what is implied from that object is an actor, you know, that is the analog of I, the actor, that is somehow animating me, the object. These are constructions of language. There's nothing inherent in our existence that generates this idea of self. These are generations of language that have allowed us to engage in critical reflection, analysis, authorship, and so forth. When we generate the idea of self, we for the first time generate the idea of other. That self and other are a dialectic, you know, meaning that they're, you know, what does self mean except in juxtaposition to other and vice versa. And so creating this metaphor of self also creates the metaphor of other. And thus we have created otherness and, you know, what is called in psychology these days, theory of mind. You know, basically what we did through our recognition of ourselves as objects, or construction of ourselves as objects, was to then generalize that to others and say, oh, what do you know? Other people are people too. And if Jaynes is right, and I think he is, this idea that other people are people is about 3,000 years old. In other words, before fairly recently in our species history, we didn't see other people as people. We first of all didn't see ourselves as objects in the environment, but secondly, we didn't see other people as being similar kinds of objects in the environment, and that people were having a very different kind of experience that we would see today to be not only alien, but probably horrifically cruel in that it was ignoring the humanity of others. But it wasn't, before this idea of self and other, it wasn't dehumanizing people. They weren't human to begin with. So I think what I find intriguing about this idea is that if this is a relatively recent development in our species history, it's no wonder that we keep falling back into it. It's no wonder that, you look around and you see some of the horrific things that are happening in the world that appear to be the dehumanization of people. Maybe it's the failure to humanize others. Maybe it's a failure of this metaphor of self to be operating very reliably, because it's, relatively new idea. Here, there's another AI image. In this case, I gave it the cue, the reification of self and other, and that's what it came up with. I think it's fantastic, myself. It's just amazing. So, anyway, the reification in this case, that is the thingification, the turning a process into a thing, is to confuse self-reference with self-existence. So rather than saying, here we are talking about ourselves, we say, here I am, period. As if it didn't have anything to do with talking about ourselves. In other words, we lose sight of our own construction of ourselves. We, in a way, in a sort of paradoxical way, have denied at least that aspect of our existence, which is the construction of self. And then when we do that, we also confuse other reference with existential threats. So we see others as having an actual existence, which threatens our existence, as opposed to seeing the other as being the other side of self, basically, which is what it is, the other half of the metaphor. So strikes me as being an interesting delve into reification. Where we may be going, and let me jump back to this timeline here. You may notice that this timeline, 3,000 years ago, there was a little bit of a rise in population. If you look at the population today, you can see we're long overdue for whatever the next revolution is. Sometimes I call it, consciousness 2.0, or at least, where we need to be thinking about doing something different than what we're doing. To be dealing with this next stage in our evolution. And this, I think, may have to do with de-reification of self and establishing more of this dialectical relationship, that is, getting ourselves out of the idea that we have an a priori existence and into the idea that we are constantly creating ourselves in this with the use of our metaphoric language. That by consciously creating ourselves, we're creating the boundaries that allow us to associate with other people. That identity, cultural identity, is not a thing you have, it's something that you're doing. It's your affiliation with groups. That conscious participation in our own culture is possible while adapting to other people without making them be like you. And this, of course, is the major issue that all of us deal with in our work, which is, how can we participate in a multicultural society, in a global village, where we value our diversity, and yet that very diversity precludes us from coordinating with each other in the traditional way, which is based on similarity. So there's this constant pressure to go back to try to make other people like you. They're trying to make you like them so that we can coordinate. This, to me, implies that we lack the coordinating system, I call it the meta-coordination, that would allow us to do that. And in other words, we don't have the tool to do the thing that we want to do. And that's what I want to spend the rest of this little time talking about. Here's Ravelli. This is Hegeland, one of his better books, I think. He says, instead of seeing the physical world as a collection of objects with definite properties, quantum theory invites us to see the physical world as a net of relations where objects are its nodes. In other words, objects do not have an existence independent from the relationship that they have with each other. And this is not a new idea, of course. This is, this is Jungian synchronicity. This is, any number of philosophers in the dialectical thinking. But we need to be reminded again, in this case, it's coming out of quantum physics, that if we forget relationships, we reify things as objects and then fall into trying to define the qualities of the objects rather than understanding the relationships that bring those objects into existence in the first place. One way to think about this this underlying relationship is with the term called co-ontology. When you think of some water that's just flowing across the ground, and think of the water and the ground as kind of in some kind of negotiation, and the water is trying to say, I want to go here, and the ground is saying, no, you can't go here, you have to go here. And the water is saying, no, I want to go here, but the ground is saying, yeah, no, sorry, you can't, but over there is okay. So this negotiation occurs, over millions of years, and here's what happens. That in the long run, there's this kind of co-ontogenic. What does that? That means that a mutual creation. Onto is beingness, and genic is to create beingness, and co is mutual. So it's the joint creation of beingness that this water and the ground are engaged in that generate what? A river, a canyon, things that appear to have an existence, but which we can see are results of this co-ontogenic relationship between water and the ground. So that's the kind of thing that Rovelli is beautifully trying to get at. And he's saying, look, here's this is not just an idea that we can understand metaphorically. This is in fact the way things work in the world. And you'll see him talk about quantum mechanics in that term. Another guy I like who talks about this is a biological constructivist named Umberto Matoyana, whom I would recommend if you happen to, if you like this, a more esoteric reference. Yeah. And of course, the one that most of us are familiar with is this Berger and Luckman social construction of reality, where you have the big C culture. I call it culture. Let's go out and do something cultural tonight, and everybody knows that you need to go to the opera. Some kind of institution like that. Those are the cultural institutions. And in the other part of this dialectic is the little culture. It's what people experience, pronounced culture. It's a cultural worldview. And Berger and Luckman famously said that we are socialized into a world of institutions, a big C culture. We in turn enact the roles that are appropriate to those institutions, which maintain the institutions in this ongoing dialectical process. The important thing for us when we talk about culture is what we put in here, the definition we're going to give. That culture is not a thing. It's not a collection of beliefs, behaviors, and values. It's not something you have. It's something you are doing. It is the coordination of meaning and action amongst people interacting within some kind of boundary. It could be a national boundary, it could be an ethnic boundary, gender boundary, generational boundary. These are all different boundary conditions, but the basic process is the same: coordinating meaning and action. That's what we do as human beings, and we use language to do that. And then we have this process of maintaining the culture, which is the kind of structuring of this meaning and action. But we have to be careful, because we create the culture. We can't say we are victims of the culture. We can't say we are even the result of the cause of the culture. We are part of the process, of the co-ontogenic process of culture. This, I think, gives us the basic idea for how we need to meta-coordinate. So if you see a culture A as being that coordinating system, and you see culture B as coordinating system B, then what we need to do if we're doing intercultural work in any form is to coordinate the coordinating systems, what we could call cultural bridging. But basically, it's to say, how do we coordinate systems without destroying them? And it's not just social scientists who are thinking about that. Corporations are constantly trying to figure out how to engage in mergers and acquisitions without destroying the very thing that they're merging with, because they don't know how to coordinate with a group that's not them. And even though they acquired the group because it's not them, they had some skill or something that was valuable for the organization. Turns out the literature says in at least 80% of the cases of mergers and acquisitions, they fail to meet their goals. Why? Because they're destroyed. You destroy the very difference that you bought in the first place through the merger and acquisition, because you don't know how to coordinate without creating similarity. And so this idea of meta-coordination is not just a social science notion, but I think it's going to be an important business notion as well. And it's generally well received. I do a lot of consulting with business organizations, and it's generally well received. But you can see that the underlying idea of it is a little bit unusual, which is this, de-reification notion. So agency is a nice idea. If we take self-consciousness as being the result of the last cognitive revolution, this next revolution, this agency, which is being able to be self-reflexive, to see ourselves generating self. Agency refers to the meta level of self-consciousness, self-reflexive consciousness, where we recognize our own creation of self and others, thus attaining the freedom of self-definition. So we say, hey, I can make myself up any way I want, but the responsibility for the definition of others, because when you are making up however you want to be, you are creating the other half of that, which is the otherness. And so we're engaging in the process of self-other construction, not just saying, oh, I'm defining my identity. It's a little more of you are participating in a relationship. You're not doing a thing, you're participating in a relationship, and that's the relationship of self and other. So here's Carla Rovelli once again says, agency, like memory, increases information by favoring one probable state over the other. So the entire world, biosphere, culture, is built on this information. And this is the idea that by exercising agency, by favoring one state over another, we are constructing reality. And we'll come back again to that at the very end, this idea. So I want to now take this notion of this sort of next impending revolution of consciousness and say, how could we apply this to the major topic areas of intercultural communication? And those topic areas, by the way, are cultural identity. How do we construct boundaries and generate cultural identity? They're interaction analysis, which many of you are interested in, on identifying cultural differences, predicting misunderstanding, and adaptation strategies, which you heard Barry mention earlier. The work I do on the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity is around adaptation strategies, and something that I'll call the generation of third culture, which I think is where we're moving here. So let me give you some ideas about how to talk about these things in a more constructivist, which means a more co-ontogenic way. When we think of distinguishing self and other, imagine that they're just a bunch of entities around, and that they have no particular distinction from each other until we draw a boundary. We, the observers, create a boundary, and we say, oh, those people are all similar because what? They live in the same country, or they're the same color, or they're the same gender, or they are of a similar age, or they like the same kind of sex, or whatever it is that we do that generates that boundary. It's us who's generating the boundary. And then we can generate another one over there and say, okay, that's another national culture. There's a third culture. And then, oh, there's an ethnic group that cuts across the cultures. And, oh, there's a super culture. There's the EU that's, that pulls a lot of those other cultures in to some other kind of configuration. Or there's a subculture or a co-culture of, a gender culture inside of a national culture. These are all observational strategies. These are all us generating boundaries. These things do not have an independent existence. And insofar as we think that they do, we have created the condition that denies us. We've basically victimized ourselves with our own creations. And I mean, look around at what's going on in the world at this very moment, I'm sad to say, and you will see people victimizing themselves with their own creations, killing themselves with their own creations. When what we can do is to stop creating it that way. Cultural identity refers to the way in which we affiliate with ourselves, and then with one of these boundary conditions. And ascription is people thinking that you belong to that group. And both of these things are going on. Sometimes they're together. So you say, hey, I belong to the group of British people, and other people say, yeah, you're British. You sound British, you look British. But sometimes they don't. So I have Korea in the U.S. I have Korean adoptees. They have a lot of, from the over this in the last century, a lot of Korean adoptees in the U.S. who look Korean, but they grew up in Kansas. People are always saying, "Where are you from?" And they say, "Kansas." And you go, "No, where are you really from?" And they say, "Lawrence." And you go, "No, I mean, like, really, where are you from?" And it pisses people off, because they don't identify with being Korean, but we try to ascribe people based on their physical appearance or some other kind of characteristics to a group that they may or may not be affiliated with. So I'm suggesting that one of the very first things we can do in all of our educational activities is a very simple thing, and that is give people a chance to talk about their affiliation and how they are ascribed and whether they think those ascriptions are similar to their affiliations. It's a simple exercise. Ask people, what are the 3 cultures you feel affiliated with? Do other people agree with that, or do they put you in different categories? Yeah, simple exercise, but very powerful. Gives people a chance to think about what they're doing, not what they have. When we another major topic of intercultural communication is in the so-called etic observational categories. Now, you probably don't know that term because you think that these categories are about real differences in cultures, like differences in language use, differences in nonverbal behavior, differences in communication style, perceptual style, cultural values. But these are not differences in culture. These are observational categories. These are ways that we as observers approach 2 or more of these boundary conditions that we have created and say, what's similar and what's different about what's going on in those conditions? We're the ones who are generating the observational categories that bring into relief various kinds of similarities and differences. And why do we do that? Well, it might have different reasons. Edward T. Hall, whom is pretty much attributed the generation of intercultural communication, was working with people who needed to learn how to communicate when they were in another culture. So he said, well, we should observe things that we call cultural differences in terms of differences in the way that people communicate, because that's what it is that we want to learn how to do better. And so his notions like high context or low context, or others of his proxemics and other uses of categories, were not about culture. I've had this discussion directly with Edward T. Hall. He used to come to the Summer Institute in Portland. And I've said, when you talk about cultural differences, you're really not talking about culture, are you? He says, no, I'm talking about the observation of culture. I'm not talking about culture. So it's a mistake for us to talk about high context cultures and low context cultures, or even more, high context people, low context people. High and low context is not a quality of culture. It is a type of observation that we are making for some purpose, in this case, to help people communicate better in another cultural context. So my second suggestion here in reconfiguring intercultural communication is to say, we must never attribute difference to culture. We attribute difference to our observation for some purpose. And doesn't mean we shouldn't be observing differences. It just means that we should be reifying those and saying that they belong to the culture. The cultures are not different. It's us who are observing the cultures as being different for some reason. Same thing when we talk about generalizations. Here's individualism and collectivism, which is a very popular category of observation. There are no individualistic and collectivist cultures. If you ask people who don't know this, are you individualist or collectivist? They go, huh? This is not a meaningful thing. It's only meaningful for us as observers to look at cultures in these terms. And what we're really saying is, if you look at a group of Chinese folks and compare it to a group of North Americans, you're more likely to observe collectivist behavior, what we define as collectivist behavior. Usually it's an answer to the question, do you think it's more important to pay attention to the group or more important to pay attention to individual desires or something like that? You're more likely to observe that behavior in a Chinese population than in the North American population, even though there are lots of Chinese who are very individualistic and lots of North Americans who are very collectivist and so forth. And you could, of course, use that with different, compare Dutch and Italians and compare men and women. But it's not because Dutch and Italians and men and women are in any way equally individualistic or collectivist. It's that in all cases, it may be useful for you to organize your perception of those groups in terms of that difference for some reason, to understand some behavior, understand some difficulty of interaction. So generalization is the probability that a particular behavior will be observed in some defined context. The stereotype is the application of the generalization to every single case, or generalizing from too small a sample. So when you say Germans drink a lot of beer, you're making an accurate generalization. When you say you're German, you must drink a lot of beer, you're making a stereotype, right? You're applying the generalization to every single case. Or you say, I met a German one time, now I know how they are. You're also stereotyping, you're generalizing from too small a sample. In all of these cases, you're failing to treat generalizations as a statement about observation rather than as a statement about the culture. Barry mentioned this developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and it has been around for a long time. It's pretty robust. This is a quilt that a student in a master's program did as Martha Grote is her name, as a project to sort of illustrate the DMIS. Yeah, it's better than the artificial intelligence. Yeah, it's real intelligence. Yeah. Anyway, I've reconfigured this idea a little bit for this presentation. I'll just take here a minute to talk about the perceptual experience of self-other relationships. And they move from ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism. Ethnocentrism, you see your culture as being kind of, or yourself as being the center of things. And ethno-relative, you sort of see your culture and yourself related to culture as part of a larger fabric. Denial is you fail to perceive the existence of self-other distinctions, and in defense, that you create simple self-other distinctions that are both fragile. So when you create a fragile self, it's easily threatened by others. And when you create fragile others, they easily also become threatened. So this condition of defense is a condition that we create of fragility relative to self and other. It's moving past that into minimization, where we focus on a more robust self, but the price we pay for that is we see others as being just variations of ourselves. And we think if we treat them like we'd like to be treated, that they'll like that. But then that doesn't always work, because other people, in fact, are different and they don't want to be treated the way that you'd like to be treated. And so we move into this more ethno-relative position of acceptance, which is recognizing self and other as similarly human, but differently complex. This is the key. You see others as being similarly human, but part of that similarity of humanness is that they are different. They're differently complex. And that leads us to equity rather than equality, which in turn allows us to talk about adaptation, which is generating third culture spaces. And this is the mechanism for meta-coordination, which I'll come to here in my last minutes. And finally, integration is living in this liminal space of being able to generate this multicultural movement. So the consciousness will be the acceptance, that's our ability to engage in self-reference, the adaptation, which are our ability to shift perspective and empathize with others, and the liminality, or the integration, which is our ability to operate in, easily in these kind of multicultural situations. We need to be answering the question, who adapts to whom? The old answer was, when in Rome, do as the Romans. The new answer is, everywhere is Rome. And the distinction between these two is that the old idea was that you had to give up who you were and become like us. whoever us was, if you want to go to Rome and get along with the Romans, you have to give up who you are and become like the Romans. The new idea is to add things. That, yeah, when you go to Rome, you need to understand something about what the Romans do, but that doesn't mean you should give up who you are. That means that you should increase your repertoire. You should get better at singing more than one song. And, you know, all of you who work with the multiple language acquisition, it's a parallel to multiple culture acquisition, you know, which is being able to be bicultural, multicultural, at least to some extent, which allows you to make these shifts. And when I, as a person from culture A, try to adapt to an organization or to a society that includes somebody from B, and B is trying to do the same thing, both of us are adapting in such a way not to give up who we are, but to generate this third culture space. The third culture space is the intersection of A, B, and the organization. The organization, in turn, operates with that third culture space to derive value from that diversity and other things that we work a lot with organizations to try to get them to realize that the value of diversity does not come from the diversity. That's reification. The value of diversity comes from people trying to adapt to each other without trying to impose their own view without trying to impose their own culture on the other culture. And that process is what it is that generates the value. So I'll leave you with this idea, Carlo Rovelli: the future is rushing towards us as a cloud of possibilities, and what they become depends on how we relate to them now. Things are not any absolute way, except insofar as we forget that we made them up. But if we keep on treating things in the same way, the possibilities keep on collapsing into the same thing over and over and over again. We need to be now relating to things differently in whatever way we can. And I've just suggested to you that one of the ways we can relate to things differently is how it is that we construe, how it is that we talk about these intercultural communication concepts in our classes and educational activities. Okay, that's what I've got to say. What do you have to say? Oh, I can't hear you, Barry.
I've just realized, yeah, just as unmute now, and I unmuted now. Yeah, tremendous presentation. Thank you so much, Milton. So much to think about and develop. Some interesting comments from our audience. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask for update, but let's go to Ian first. Ian, I'm not sure if you've got anything you'd like to ask or add, given what Milton's just had to say.
Well, I found it fascinating, this this constructivist approach, and the idea of culture not as a thing out there, which seems to me, certainly, as I haven't called myself an interculturalist, but has dominated the discussions about this. And I'm just wondering, what occurred to me there is, what would you think practitioners, one or two things that practitioners could do to, let's say, mold their teaching, their training in a way that takes into account of this better, this concept. Well, because it's very, people like the idea of thinking of culture as a thing. It helps, and so we're making life complicated for them first, but then possibly making things easier in the longer run.
Yeah, that's why people didn't like my saying, don't use the metaphor of an iceberg, right? Yeah, but I would repeat that, stop using the metaphor of an iceberg, use something more, more dynamic to get this idea. I mean, I use this river metaphor, but there may be other metaphors that we could be using that would get the idea that we're engaged in a process rather than having a thing. Sometimes with people, I do a kind of de-reification exercise where I say, think of something you have and change it into something you do. So for instance, do you have a relationship? And people say, well, yeah, I have a relationship. You say, well, change that. Okay, well, I'm engaging in this, activities with the other person, or we're coordinating with each other, or we're, making a life together, or other kinds of things that change having something into doing something. We should be careful when we talk about culture, therefore, not to list things. Here are the beliefs, here are the values, here are the behaviors that go along with that group as opposed to this other group here. That's a reification that takes our observation out of the picture. That's why I'm constantly using this etic observational categories, meaning it's we who are generating the difference that we think is important for some reason, not that we're discovering that in the ethnographies of these different cultural groups. And by the way, we should use this same idea for competence. Competence is not a thing you have, it's something that you do. Competence is like riding a bicycle. You don't have bicycle riding competence, you just know how to do it, and everybody has to learn how to do it. Nobody starts out with bicycle riding competence, but almost everybody can learn how to do it, but it's not a thing that you have. And we make this mistake a lot. We want to search people's inner lives for their open-mindedness or their curiosity or their tolerance of ambiguity or all these things that we think people have, but they don't. We just, we're either more or less competent in the way that we're able to coordinate with other people. And so the more we can keep our eye on trying to make things a process rather than a collection of things, I think would be the short answer to that. To keep including ourselves as observers in the things that we're observing would be another way of talking about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
so if I could then step in there, we had an interesting question relating to your last response, Milton, from Angelica de Paiva, which is it to be understood that creating these categories is or can be endless? Could one review these categories? Could one not, e.g., reevaluate or redefine?
Absolutely. Categories are classifications. This goes back to that old general semantics idea, that categories are not things that exist in reality. Categories are our classification of things. And we may have some reason for classifying things in a particular way. It's not like we shouldn't classify things. It's just that we shouldn't forget that we're classifying things. And then, of course, we can reclassify them, because lots of times classifications that were useful for one purpose are not useful for another purpose, or at one time they're not useful for another time. And if we reify them and forget that we made them up, then we think that somehow they're unchangeable because, I don't know, they're part of reality.
Okay, got that. And Mafidas Arias has asked, oh, I just lost it. Hang on, come back. Can you please talk about the river metaphor and the control of Mother Nature? Thanks. Good luck with that one.
Yeah. And you notice I didn't show you a picture of a dam, did I? No, I showed you a picture of a natural canyon. Okay, so we're talking about this, the water and the ground, are interacting with each other, but when you put people into the picture, I mean, the fact is we are organisms, we are products of this planet and of the universe, and we are doing things that people do that are generating certain pressures in the systems that we operate in. And some of those things may be destructive of other species. Some of them may be destructive of our own species. But we're, of course, not the only ones that do that. We have to remember every time you take a breath, that oxygen is the result of the death of a whole bunch of carbon dioxide breathing organisms.
Mm-hmm.
So, we exist on the death of the previous species. And maybe that will be the case for the next dominant species in the earth. But maybe not. And if we use our consciousness in an appropriate way, I'd like to think that maybe we could do it differently.
Great, thank you. Iman Bufaden has made some interesting comments in the chat, and here she is now saying if culture is something that we do, and thus it is far from the societal norms and expectations, how could we define something as being Eurocentric and even Euro-relativist? Here you are in Europe, in Italy. Go for it.
Well, we can be anything centric, you know, Eurocentric, Americentric, Japanocentric, you know, we can, you know, whenever we forget that that this is our construction of a particular group of people, typically who are coordinating with each other in a way to generate a viable condition in the world. But that doesn't mean that that's the way everybody else either does it or should be doing it. And when we forget that, then it's when we become centric. And I think it's just, they're all pieces of being ethnocentric. You know, it's, you know, Eurocentric, Americentric, you know, male-centric, whatever it is, you know, it's just, it's because you think that somehow you're the center of things. But of course, we're not.
Okay, great. And I think we're almost coming to the end of it, but Thomas Tinnefeld, Professor Thomas Tinnefeld, has asked, and Thomas, please excuse me for reading it out rather than asking you to say it, but what role does language play in the process of reification, and how can we mitigate its effects in intercultural contexts?
Language is the culprit and language is the key. It's the culprit because language necessarily reifies. You know, whenever we give form to a feeling, whenever we put a word on something, whenever we generate a classification, we're generating a reality that did not previously exist. And in that sense, we are reifying something, you know, that didn't have that real existence before we spoke of it. At the same time that language is the culprit, language is the key, because it's by using language metaphorically to refer to itself, that is to engage in a meta-languaging ability, that meta-languaging is what it is that lets us see that happening. And in seeing that happening, we can make it happen differently.
Okay, and on language, and this is, I think, our last question that we can take, is from Rania Kokino, who says, do you think that reification, and she puts in brackets hypostasis, of your intercultural approach might be different if you were a member of a less dominant language group? Aha.
Well, I think it might be different in the sense of stronger than what I'm saying here. I'm saying that we need to be aware of how we're constructing reality. If you're from a group that's experienced oppression at the hands of somebody who's constructed a dominant reality and thinks that's natural, you know, that it's some sort of a neoliberal survival of the fittest social Darwinist position, then yeah, you're going to be stronger about this and say you're making that up. I don't think you have to be a member of a group that's experienced oppression to come to that same conclusion. But maybe it feels like less of an existential issue. For me, I think, look around, it's pretty much of an existential issue, whether you're from a dominant or not, or a non-dominant group, that we need to start exercising consciousness in the way in which we construct reality.
Okay, and we have one more question, very, very brief, Milton, if you don't mind, because we need to get on just to let you go and I guess let the world get on to its evening. And let me just get it right this time. Yeah, it's from Ahmed Hussein. And it's very much where you are, creating the virtual third culture spaces means breaking this centric thing. In a nutshell, here it is. What do you think is needed besides a constructivist and a human mindset? Anything else needed?
I think we need to have support for that. I think it's one thing for human being A to say, I'm going to adapt to you B, and B to say, okay, I'm going to adapt to you A. We know that it's difficult, even in relationships, in interpersonal relationships, to have that kind of equal third culture construction is almost a characteristic of the very best interpersonal relationships. So we know it's a difficult thing to do all by itself. What we need to have to make it work on a larger scale is intentional support for that activity. And I work a lot with organizations on how they can support the existence, the generation of these third culture spaces. What it means is that they have to stop insisting that there's only one way of doing things, and to say, it's okay for you to come up with a way that's going to get that done in some particular context. And larger societies, if they're going to be multicultural societies, have got to figure out, how can we generate these coordinating mechanisms that don't demand that we all be the same in some way? And I see some movement in that direction. I see a greater understanding of this idea of third culture, which is, it's becoming a more of a notion that people are easily talking about. And I think the next stage is going to be to see active support for it.
Good, we'll see where we go. It's our last question. We have to end the session there because we're actually now on 1700. Lots and lots of messages, as you'll see. Milton saying, thank you so much for your thought-provoking and really wonderful talk. Great food for thought. So thank you again. A wonderful session, and really, really glad you could join us. Okay, just to quickly finish off the session. Obviously, Milton Bennett's session will be available in the ICC journal, and Milton, I'll be checking it with you before we publish it. And also the recording will be available for those of you who want to follow up. Our next one on October 24th is from Martin Bond, who used to run the EU Correspondence Connection. He's now a lecturer at Regent's University in London. And actually is talking about UK universities and transnational education. What is the relationship as it is going to develop, or as it can develop, between European and UK universities, which is a very important development for us. Okay, let us move forward. The other thing, obviously, is we're going to have our new annual conference in Larnaca in Cyprus from the 9th to the 11th of May in 2025. And the title, Redefining Language Education, when our colleagues and our visitors will be looking at technology, accessibility to language education, and language education as empowerment. Really, really important session. And of course, today is the European Day of Languages. So a real celebratory time, Milton, to have your presentation. And last of all, as we said, the ICC journal will be coming out in the next 2 weeks, and it will feature, with Milton's permission, I will make sure I get that before we take off, of the presentations and essays by members of our organization. And you'll find that a really, really interesting operation. Good, okay. And the other thing, of course, which you need to know about is our schools operation, our teacher training operation, Euralta, which is run by our president, and basically really making sure that we have the opportunity to learn more about that. Go on our website and you'll find more about it. Okay, anything else we need to add? Yes, if you are representing an organization in Europe and beyond, because we did have somebody from way outside, basically ICC membership is open to you, and you can belong to our group and really be able to access all our facilities, which many of the members here today are doing. I have one hand up, Angelica de Paiva. If I allow that to go, as I thank you for your participation today for the European Day of Languages, what a great day to be able to celebrate it, and a great way to celebrate it. Angelica, would you like to say goodbye to the group? or has the moment passed?
Yes, I can do it in English and in German. Vielen Dank für den tiefsinnigen Vortrag, für das ganze Wissen, das uns übertragen wurde. I thank you all, and I'm really very grateful for being with you every time I can.
Alles gut, alles klar, vielen Dank. Okay, all right.
Dank.
And wonderful day. And Ian, I don't know if there's anything you need to add to close up.
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to say again, thank you very much, Milton. Fascinating talk, and thanks to everybody for coming today.
Good, there we go. Thank you very, very much indeed for participating. And Lillian,
Thank you.
close us down. Thank you to everybody.